Ron Howard has always been the calm one in a room full of storms, the type of director who practices respect. Please subscribe. It means a lot to me and costs you nothing, patience, and quiet leadership. But the moment someone asked him about the darker side of the business he grew up in, his whole vibe changed. His voice dropped, his eyes hardened, and he said something that still shakes people today. You wouldn't believe what those legends did when the cameras stopped. To him, that so-called golden age of Hollywood wasn't golden at all. It was a polished mask hiding a mean, messy world. He said the industry back then was built on silence, intimidation, and straight-up exploitation. Fame acted like a shield, and power excused everything. The same stars who shaped America's dreams were also out here wrecking lives behind closed doors. And nobody dared speak up because the system protected its own. Now, decades later, Ron is finally willing to say their names and expose what really went down. Errol Flynn, the devil, hiding behind a charming smile. Before there was James Bond or Jack Sparrow, there was Errol Flynn, the wild, reckless adventurer who lit up the screen with swagger, danger, and unstoppable charisma. On camera, he was the perfect hero. But once he stepped off the set, the truth got way darker. Flynn moved through Hollywood like he owned it, fueled by ego, booze, and a need to push every limit he could find. Born in 1909 in Tasmania, he landed in Hollywood in the 1930s and blew up instantly after Captain Blood made him a star. Studios built entire empires around his face, his voice, and his swagger. But the shine didn't match the reality. Behind the smile was a man who acted like rules didn't apply to him, and everyone around him felt that energy. By the early 1940s, his reputation was drowning in scandal. Flynn got hit with serious accusations from multiple women, grown women, who said his behavior crossed major lines. The whole country watched the case explode across newspapers, turning courtrooms into circus arenas. And instead of showing concern, Flynn sat there laughing, cracking jokes, and acting like the world couldn't touch him because he was too famous to fall. Warner Brothers threw money, lawyers, and everything else they had into protecting him. Fans camped outside the courthouse screaming his name. Executives whispered deals in back rooms. People suddenly changed their stories, and witnesses disappeared just as fast as they arrived. When the verdict came back and he walked free, Hollywood celebrated, but the insiders knew the story wasn't over. Years later, private letters popped up showing Flynn bragging about his conquests and mocking the people who feared him. Ron Howard once admitted that reading those letters and studying that trial changed him forever. That's when I realized Hollywood could protect monsters if they smiled for the camera, he said, and that truth hit him hard. To the public, Flynn stayed a lovable rogue, but to people on the inside, he became a warning, a reminder of what power, ego, and unchecked fame can turn a man into. His addictions spiraled, his money vanished, and his body paid the price for the life he refused to slow down. By 1959, at just 50, his body collapsed in Vancouver after years of heavy drinking, drugs, and total self-destruction. His autopsy listed heart failure and cirrhosis, but Ron always believed the real cause was lifestyle, plain and simple. In his words, Flynn died the same way he lived, taking everything and giving nothing. Errol Flynn's downfall became the blueprint for Hollywood's moral decay, proof that charm can hide some serious darkness, and that fame can only protect someone for so long before the truth catches up. Kirk Douglas, the man who couldn't stop swinging. To Ron Howard, Kirk Douglas was the ultimate contradiction of Hollywood's golden era. A man who talked about honor and justice on screen while spreading fear, anger, and chaos behind the scenes. He was a superstar built on grit and glory, but inside the studios, plenty of people whispered another story entirely. Born as Izer Danielovich in 1916 to struggling immigrant parents, Kirk Douglas climbed out of poverty with nothing but grit and stubborn fire, pushing him forward. By the time Spartacus turned him into a worldwide icon, he had it all: fame, money, respect, and power. But people who actually worked beside him remembered a whole different side of that success, a darker energy that never clocked out when the cameras did. Crew members described Douglas as a storm in human form, impossible to satisfy, quick to snap, and known for outbursts that left people shaken. Actress Deborah Paget once said, "He didn't just want to dominate a scene, he wanted to dominate everybody in it." That line stuck with Ron Howard, who later admitted, "There's a kind of rage under that smile, the kind that doesn't fade, the kind that eats a person alive if they let it." That fire followed Douglas throughout his entire career, becoming part of his legend and his warning label. For years, Hollywood insiders whispered about his behavior toward women, grown women, stories that floated through dressing rooms, studio offices, and late-night conversations long after shooting wrapped. Rumors pointed to messy encounters, situations where his fame and power let him push boundaries no one else could get away with. The stories never turned into charges, but they lived on as part of the complicated shadow behind his superstar glow. Even after he passed away in 2020, at the age of 103, the conversations didn't disappear. They came back louder, not as gossip, but as a cultural reckoning. People were finally talking about the cost of that era's power, the silence it demanded, and the fear it fed. On film sets, Douglas could inspire a crew one moment and intimidate them the next, leaving everyone on edge about which version would show up each day. Stanley Kubrick, who directed him twice, called him the most driven man I've ever met and the hardest to control, a compliment and a warning wrapped together. To Ron Howard, the biggest lesson from Douglas's career wasn't about talent or awards. It was about power, and how dangerous it becomes when a person thinks the rules don't apply to them. Hollywood let Douglas move through his world like a king, and plenty of people paid the price for it. When Douglas accepted an honorary Oscar in 1996, many viewers saw an older man trying to make peace with a long, complicated life. But Ron Howard saw something different. A performer giving his final act, a man still trying to outrun the ghosts that followed him since his earliest roles. Beneath all that applause sat a truth Hollywood never wanted to admit. Some of its biggest legends built their careers on brilliance and on fear. Faye Dunaway, the queen of cold-blooded control. If Errol Flynn represented corruption and Kirk Douglas symbolized raw rage, then Faye Dunaway showed Hollywood a different kind of danger, cruelty delivered with a smile. To Ron Howard, she proved that harm in the industry didn't always come from fists or fury. Sometimes it came from control, humiliation, and an ego sharp enough to cut through an entire set. Born in 1941 in Bascom, Florida, Dunaway's rise was unreal. Bonnie and Clyde in 1967, Chinatown in 1974. She looked untouchable, a goddess of the screen with ice in her stare and mystery in her voice. But backstage, stories piled up like train collisions. Crew members whispered about her explosive tantrums, endless demands, and the way she treated assistants like they were replaceable tools. Her Mommy Dearest co-star Rutanya Alda once said, "You could feel the fear on set," and that quote still circulates in Hollywood circles today. Dunaway's talent was undeniable, but so was the chill she brought into every room she dominated. Everyone on that set waited for Faye Dunaway to blow up because the tension followed her like a shadow. The movie was supposed to be a dark portrait of abuse, but it ended up reflecting her own behavior in real time. And the wild part? While she was playing Joan Crawford, a woman famous for icy cruelty, Dunaway reportedly slid right into that same energy without even trying. Director Frank Perry later admitted he thought about walking away from the whole production because of her explosive behavior. People behind the scenes said she hurled objects, yelled at makeup artists, and once refused to shoot a single frame until the lighting made her look divine. Ron Howard, years later, used her as an example of what happens when an actor's obsession with control turns into emotional warfare. And the stories kept piling up. On The Wicked Lady, Dunaway allegedly slapped a cameraman, then spat on a crew member during another meltdown. On Don Juan DeMarco, people said she went after assistants so harshly that production shut down for a day just to let everyone breathe. Her former manager, Jay Bernstein, once said, "Faye doesn't just play divas, she becomes them." That line stuck because everyone knew exactly what he meant. By the 2000s, her reputation finally outran her talent, and Hollywood stopped calling. Directors refused to deal with her, saying she was impossible to manage and too unpredictable to risk on a tight schedule. In 2011, after being fired from a Broadway revival of Tea at 5, she blamed everyone but herself, refusing to admit her part in the downfall. When a journalist asked Ron Howard about her legacy, he answered carefully but sharply, "She chased perfection so hard, she forgot compassion." That hit harder than any insult because it was the truth wrapped in a calm voice. Her downfall wasn't a dramatic crash. It was a slow, steady unraveling. The woman who once owned Hollywood ended up alone, avoided even at screenings celebrating her own movies. To Ron Howard, she represented the real cost of cruelty, a warning that talent without empathy eventually burns everything around it, including the person holding the torch. "People talk about power," he once said, "but in Hollywood, power without grace turns to poison." That line could have been carved onto the studio gates. John Wayne, the tyrant of the West. Few stars ever towered over Hollywood the way John Wayne did. To millions, he was America on two legs, the fearless cowboy, the tough soldier, the symbol of rugged pride. But Ron Howard, who grew up watching him on old black and white TV, eventually learned the real story behind the myth, and it shook him. "When I learned what he was really like," Howard said, "I stopped seeing the hero. I saw the bully wearing his country like a costume." Born Marion Morrison in 1907 in Iowa, Wayne rose through the studio system by building a myth of unstoppable masculinity. By the 1950s, he wasn't just an actor, he was an entire ideology. He treated disagreement like weakness and viewed progress as betrayal. On set, he ruled through fear, barking orders and humiliating technicians if they didn't meet his expectations. People stayed quiet because standing up to him felt impossible, and Wayne liked it that way. Christopher Mitchum once said that when John Wayne, the Duke, got mad, the whole room turned ice cold, like the air itself was scared to move. You either agreed with him or you got pushed out, no second chances. To Ron Howard, that kind of energy wasn't leadership. It was intimidation dressed up as discipline, the total opposite of real art. Wayne's harshness didn't stop at the job either. People who worked with him said he belittled women, mocked indigenous actors on Western sets, and dismissed black performers who pushed back against the stereotypes Hollywood kept forcing on them. His infamous 1971 Playboy interview resurfaced decades later, and it hit like a shockwave. In it, he made comments about native lands, about minority communities, and about who he thought was fit for the future of the country. And every line revealed a man whose mindset was frozen in another century. On the set of The Searchers, Wayne clashed hard with director John Ford over how to portray Ethan Edwards, a violent, vengeful former Confederate. Ford pushed for moral complexity, but Wayne wanted sympathy for the character even when the script showed him doing awful things. In the final cut, the character's cruelty stayed visible, and so did Wayne's own contempt for any attempt to soften the role. Ron Howard studied that performance years later at USC and said, "It's terrifying because you can't tell where the role ends and the man begins." Even near the end of his life, weakened by cancer, Wayne never apologized or rethought anything. He brushed off critics as soft and blamed shifting culture for why so many people pushed away from him. He passed in 1979 at age 72, still celebrated by millions. But to filmmakers like Ron Howard, his life became the perfect warning about what happens when power grows on top of prejudice instead of growth. "The myth survived," Howard once said, "but the man behind it never earned the legend." Roman Polanski, The Exile of Shame. For Ron Howard, the name Roman Polanski symbolized one brutal truth Hollywood never wanted to face: that enormous talent can sit right next to deep wrongdoing, and sometimes talent hides the worst parts of a person. Howard once admitted he admired Polanski's films before understanding the man behind them. "I realized talent doesn't excuse a person," he said. "Sometimes it just hides them." That hit people like a revelation. Polanski's rise looked unstoppable at first. Born in Paris in 1933 to Polish parents, he survived the trauma of World War II, carrying an emotional darkness that poured into his work. His films Knife in the Water and Rosemary's Baby turned him into a global sensation. Critics called him a genius, a director who could turn paranoia into pure cinema. But the shadow in his movies wasn't fiction. It was a reflection of something inside him. And then the illusion shattered. In the late 1970s, Polanski was arrested for assaulting a grown woman after a private photo session in Los Angeles. The evidence was overwhelming, and he pled guilty to charges involving unlawful conduct with an adult before sentencing. Hollywood froze, unsure whether to support the artist or condemn the man, and Polanski made the choice himself. He fled the country before a judge could deliver the final punishment. His story became one of the darkest stains on Hollywood's legacy, a reminder that genius doesn't erase harm, and fame shouldn't cover it up. Ron Howard studied that chapter and said Polanski proved something chilling. Brilliance can coexist with evil, and that's why you can't let talent blind you. Roman Polanski fled the United States and stayed overseas, settling in France where he knew he couldn't be extradited. That decision split Hollywood straight down the middle. Some condemned him immediately, while others defended him with that old tortured artist excuse that people use when they don't want to face the truth. To Ron Howard, who was still a young filmmaker at the time, the reaction felt like betrayal from the very industry he loved. "They talked about art while a woman's life was shattered," he said years later. To him, Polanski's escape became one of the darkest moral stains on Hollywood's history. And while Polanski ran from accountability, he kept making movies overseas, big movies, award-winning movies, like nothing ever happened. When The Pianist won an Oscar in 2003, something unbelievable happened. The entire Dolby Theater stood up and applauded a man who wasn't even allowed back in the country. Howard refused to stand, choosing to stay seated while the room roared. "I thought of that woman," he said later, "and what that applause must have felt like to her ears, even decades later." The way the industry separated genius from guilt infuriated him to his core. In 2020, when Polanski won France's César Award, protesters stormed out of the ceremony. To Ron Howard, that moment felt like justice arriving late, but still arriving. It took the world more than 40 years to finally say what should have been obvious from day one: that a person doesn't stop being dangerous just because they know how to frame a perfect shot. He told Vanity Fair in 2021, "Hollywood protects the artist and abandons the harmed, and that's why the system keeps breaking." Polanski still lives in Europe, technically untouchable, but his name carries a heavy shadow everywhere he goes. For Ron Howard, Polanski represents everything that poisoned the so-called Golden Age, a machine built to shield the powerful and bury the wounded. Hollywood forgives anything, he once said bitterly, as long as the lighting is good. Mickey Rooney, the smile that lied. If Roman Polanski symbolized Hollywood's hypocrisy, Mickey Rooney represented the industry's biggest illusion, the lie that a charming grin could erase every cruel thing happening behind it. Ron Howard grew up watching Rooney's bright, cheerful musicals on late-night TV, and he said the truth about Rooney hit him like a punch. He was the face of joy, Howard once said, but behind that smile was misery, and worse, he spread it. Born Joseph Ewell Jr. in 1920, Rooney became Hollywood's first huge young star, rising to fame at a pace almost nobody had ever seen. By adulthood, he was one of the highest-paid actors in America, with MGM building entire franchises on his grin, selling him as the all-American boy who could sing, dance, and charm an entire nation. But fame that big twists a person early, and Rooney was no exception. His personal life became legendary in all the wrong ways. 8 marriages, endless cheating, non-stop gambling, and a long list of people he embarrassed or mistreated behind closed doors. His ex-wife, Ava Gardner, once said he was the shortest man with the biggest ego in the world, and everyone close to him knew exactly what she meant. And the darkness didn't stop there. In 2011, his 8th wife, Jan Chamberlain, and his adult stepson were accused of mistreating him emotionally and financially, turning his later years into chaos, legal battles, and heartbreak. Ron Howard said that Rooney's life showed how deep the cracks ran in old Hollywood, how the business loved to present a fantasy even while the real story was falling apart behind the curtain. They were draining Rooney's accounts and cutting him off from the people who actually cared about him, but the truth is this. Long before that final chapter, the harm Mickey Rooney caused others was already infamous. Former co-stars talked about him like he was a walking storm, charming one second and dangerous the next. Judy Garland, the friend who knew him better than almost anyone during the MGM years, once said privately that he could make you laugh until you cried, then crush your spirit in the very same breath. Garland, already pressured by studio bosses and struggling under enormous emotional weight, later hinted that Rooney, not just the executives, added to the pain she carried every day. By the 1960s, Rooney's career had fallen apart in real time. Addiction, money trouble, and scandal followed him like a shadow he couldn't outrun. In a 1979 interview, Rooney tried to romanticize it all by saying, "I've lived 1,000 lives," but Ron Howard wasn't impressed. "He lived every one of them for himself," he said. Even when he got older, Rooney's bitterness didn't slow down. He pointed fingers at everyone, studios, marriages, fate, even the universe itself, acting like the world owed him something. When he passed in 2014 at age 93, his estate was worth less than $20,000, and his body went unclaimed until friends stepped in and raised money for a small, quiet funeral in Los Angeles. It was a heartbreaking ending for someone who once symbolized pure joy on screen. To Ron Howard, Rooney's story was the final piece that made the pattern impossible to ignore. "The Golden Age smiles were masks," he said. "He made the world laugh while he was breaking on the inside," and Howard believed that might be one of Hollywood's saddest evils, the kind where deep pain gets turned into performance, and the whole world claps without seeing what's happening behind the curtain. For Howard, these stories were never about revenge or gossip. They were warnings carved into history. The Golden Age wasn't gold at all. It was built on silence, control, and people getting crushed behind the glow of fame. And as he once said, the scariest monsters aren't in horror movies. They're the ones the spotlight protects. So tell me, which of these 6 Hollywood legends shocked you the most? The Predator, the tyrant, or the smiling liar? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Golden Scape for more untold stories from the dark heart of Hollywood.